Haha, Amy, that's funny. Keep calm and don't run off.
We are live.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Policy, Finance, and HR remote meeting. Everyone is attending virtually, and I should say this is the March 12th, 2024 meeting. All council committee members and staff are participating virtually. To help our audience follow along, I'll state each section of the agenda aloud. We are streaming live on our virtual engagement hub, which is accessible through the virtual engagement hub link on the front page of the city's website. We also have an option for the public to listen live by phone at 855-925-2801, meeting code 5257. So for those of you out there with us today, welcome. For today's meeting, we have the option for people to call in and comment live during the meeting. To call in and comment live, use the same number I already said, which is 855-925-2801 and meeting code 5257. Your phone will be muted and you'll hear the meeting live. At this point, speakers will need to push *3 to enter the speaker queue. I will go through and introduce the committee members and staff who are participating virtually. Council and staff, as I call your name, please say a quick hello. Councilwoman Maggie Ullman.
Good morning, everybody.
Councilwoman Kim Roney.
Good morning.
City Manager Deborah Campbell.
Good morning.
Assistant City Manager Rachel Wood.
Good morning.
Assistant City Manager Ben Woody.
Good morning.
City Attorney Brad Branham.
Good morning.
And Manager of Budget and Forecasting Taylor Floyd.
Good morning.
Okay, those are my introductions. So we're going to first, I approve the minutes, hopefully. I need a motion to approve the February 13th, 2024 minutes.
So moved.
Second.
All right, I have a motion and a second, and I'll do a roll call vote. Councilwoman Maggie Ullman.
Aye.
Councilwoman Kim Roney.
Aye.
And myself, aye. Okay, the minutes are adopted. And now, I don't know, Deborah, if you want me to turn it over to you or if I should go straight to Taylor Floyd on the fiscal year 2024-2025 fees and charges recommendations.
Good morning again, and thank you, Mayor. This is that time of year when we look at what it costs for us to deliver critical services to our community. And so today we are going to look at a number of areas in which we are recommending an adjustment in the cost to the customer to provide these services. And Taylor Floyd will kick us off. And as you may notice, we have a village of other staff who will be able to respond to any questions that you all may have. So I will turn it over to Taylor.
Thanks, Ms. Campbell. Good morning again, Mayor and committee members. Again, Taylor Floyd, Budget Manager. Going to roll through a number of recommended changes to our fees and charges as we do every year as part of the budget process. You can go on to the next slide. So a quick outline of where we're headed. We'll give a brief overview of kind of those fees and charges, how we determine what services we charge for, how that impacts our revenues. And then we'll go specifically into a number of the recommended changes and then wrap up with next steps. Next slide. So key takeaways, again, we do this every year as part of the budget process. We bring forward these recommendations early in the process so that we can communicate those changes to customers and bake those revenue impacts into the budget that the manager brings you all in May. One key piece of information, fees and charges represent a small portion of our general fund revenues, but they are the major source for our enterprise funds, again, because those enterprise funds typically rely on customers to fund those services. And then as far as what we're recommending for next year's budget, there's a continuation of modest increases to those fees that are paid by most households in the city. That includes water, stormwater, and solid waste fees. And then we also have a number of changes in our parking fund. And those are really intended to help us raise the revenue to address the $11.3 million of repairs that were identified in our parking garages. Next slide. So again, kind of high level, why do we charge for services? A few reasons. One is kind of that customer versus community benefit. Just to use an example, probably one of the more obvious community benefits where we still may charge would be like a after school program, right? There's a direct benefit to the customers of those programs, but there's also a community benefit to have opportunities for young folks to have a place to go after school. So there's a value there. So we may not charge full cost for that versus sticking with the Parks and Recreation theme here, maybe an adult tennis lesson as an example, right? There's a little more direct benefit to the individual that's taking that lesson. So we may charge close to or full cost recovery for that. Another reason that we charge for service is to ensure access. And I think the best example of this is with parking, right? Part of the reason that we charge for parking downtown is because it's in high demand. Folks want to go down there and avail themselves of all the great things in downtown Asheville. So we want to make sure that there are parking spots available for people to do that. Charging for parking is a way to make sure that folks aren't kind of camped out in those spaces and it's not, one car is there all day. And then in some instances, we have some statutory requirements to provide a service and perhaps even charge for that service. I think development related items are probably the best example of that. So how do we set these fees and charges? Again, we're looking at a few different things. One, as I already mentioned, is the cost to provide that service. So how much do we actually, does it cost us to deliver that, whether it's a Parks and Recreation program or a development fee review or something else? Who benefits? Again, I already talked about that. Is it really an individual benefit or is it a broader community benefit? In the latter case, we may not charge that full cost to provide the service. And then we also rely a lot on technical experts to help us determine what the appropriate amount is to charge through fee studies and through some other information that we get from those technical outside experts that we rely on. We'll talk a little bit about some examples of that later as well. Next slide. So driving that point home on how do these revenues impact our budget on the general fund side, again, you can see fees, charges, permits are around 11% of the general fund. A not insignificant number, or a percentage, but surely not where our property and sales tax are. Again, that's about 3/4 of that. So that's kind of in juxtaposition to the next slide, which is our enterprise funds, where you can see most of the revenue coming in on that side is from charges for services, fees, and permits. So again, a big piece in the enterprise funds. Next slide. All right, so moving into the specific recommendations, this one you all should be, I think, pretty familiar with. We've had some conversations over the last few months about our water resources and the needs there. You can go to the next slide. Before we get into those specifics, we did want to, again, kind of hit that household impact. This is for the typical residential customer. Again, kind of the solid waste, the stormwater at tier 2, which is what most residential customers are at. And then what we've been using as kind of our average volumetric consumption of 6 CCS per month. You can see that, again, that total of all of the recommended changes for that typical household would be just under $20 a year. I do want to make note again that this is for residential customers. Our average or regular standard residential customer. There are certainly bigger changes that will impact other customers on water fees especially. So I just wanted to make note of that before we get into water. Next slide. So we showed you all this slide at the retreat. we wanted to kind of come back to this and talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities that we have in some of these funds. Again, this will be sort of a variation on a theme as we go through the different enterprise funds, but we have some really significant needs identified as on infrastructure and deferred maintenance in our water resources fund. That's around $240 million of identified projects. And another thing, again, we've talked to you all about is that our current rate structure is inequitable among our rate classes. So one of the reasons we're recommending what we are is to try to rebalance that, and that will, just to acknowledge that will require some larger increases for certain ratepayers. On the opportunity side, we have good information to address these challenges. Some of that comes from the cost of service study. Again, you all heard from Raftalis over the last few months, and we think they've worked with us to provide an efficient and equitable multi-year approach to adjusting those fees so that the fees do reflect the cost to provide service to those customer classes. We also have some significant projects underway. The biggest one right now anyway is the meter replacement project, and that's really going to help us to improve the data that we have coming from those meters, the consistency in our billing, and some customer service, especially being able to go to monthly billing. And then we've also, as we always do, are looking for grant opportunities. We've identified specifically some grants to help us with some other needs in the capital fund, including our lead service line replacement project. Next slide. So a kind of high level water resources. It is our largest enterprise fund at $44 million. It has a good debt rating, which helps us to be cost effective in our delivery of service, especially as it relates to addressing these capital needs by lowering our borrowing costs. We have those technical experts at Raftalis help us with our rate modeling, figure out again how we are equitable in the way that we're charging our customers and what our needs are as it relates to that debt and those capital repairs. Capital and debt is a significant chunk of that $44 million. Again, $13 million in the current year. That does fluctuate year to year, but that's what it is this year. We have that significant almost $30 million meter replacement project that's underway. And then we don't want to forget that we had that pretty substantial loss of revenue, and we have a customer impact slide on this a little later from 2020. The loss of that capital fee was an impact to the fund, especially as it relates to capital funding. So we're trying to incrementally get back to where we need to be to replace that lost revenue so that we can continue to invest in the system. Next slide. So we are recommending, I know we've shown you all some options where staff is recommending the 3-year phase-in. We're doing that really for 2 reasons. One is we think it helps to eliminate ratepayer inequity faster than that 5-year phase-in project. And just to kind of drive that point home, what that means is, that some of our ratepayers have been paying the cost of other ratepayers. So we're really just trying to right size the fees to align with that. And we think the 3-year phase-in is the right path forward so that we can get to that ratepayer equity faster. And then the other piece is the financial sufficiency. So we're really trying to make sure that we can continue to issue that debt at an affordable cost and that we can get these big capital projects done. Part of that is making sure that we have good reserves. Another part of that is, committing to funding that capital is going to keep that good debt rating that we have from the rating agencies. And then ultimately, if you look at the difference between the 3 and 5-year plans, the 5-year plan will actually require us to get to higher rates to achieve the same reserves. So we think that 3-year phase-in is the right path forward. Next slide. So what does that mean for next year, the first year of that 3-year plan? You can see the proposed changes from the current year to next year. On the base fee side over there, pretty minimal, really just a minor increase to that 5/8 inch meter. And then on the volumetric side, that's where you see some of those more significant impacts, especially for some of our commercial, manufacturing, and wholesale customers. So again, you all have seen this before. We wanted to kind of focus in. This is the first year of that 3-year phase in, but really wanted to hone in on that since that is what we're asking to move forward to council and ultimately to be approved. I think next slide will kind of focus a little bit in on what the impact is on that single family residential. You can see again that volumetric fee is not changing for those customers, for that customer class, but they will pay that slight increase on the base fee for that 5/8 inch meter because that's what residential customers have. So there is a minor increase, but again, it is I do believe minor is on residential family customers. Next slide. So what does that mean, again, for the typical customers? These are actual customers that we pulled out as representative of in each of these classes. And you can see the changes, again, for the residential with that standard 6 CCF per month use, which is 12 on the bi-monthly bill, a really minimal increase there of 0.5%. And then some more substantial increases for the other customers. But again, this is really about right sizing the bill to what it costs to serve those customers. And ultimately, while some of these percentages are substantial, if you look at it from a bi-monthly increase, some of those are, especially in those 2 commercial classes in the middle, are not substantial, they're $60 a month increases essentially, or bi-monthly increases, excuse me. Next slide. So again, this is looking at, or just kind of a reminder about that capital fee. That's why that single family, kind of that standard customer bill goes down in FY21 is the loss of that fee. You can see we've incrementally increased from there, but we're probably still not back to where we would be had we not lost that fee. And we really are kind of flattening that increase for the current year for residential customers. Next slide. So what are we funding with this additional revenue? Again, it's really all focused on those capital needs. We have $240 million that we've identified. One is that ongoing meter replacement project, and then a number of water treatment plants. These are just a few examples of some of the significant projects that we have in that $240 million. Councilmember Roney.
Oh, it was an error of pressing the button. Sorry to interrupt.
Sure, no problem. So again, that's not the full $240 million, but we just wanted to pull out some of the significant projects that we've identified that need to happen over the next several years, or again, in the case of the meter replacement project, are already underway. Next slide. Any questions on water before we transition into parking? Councilmember Roney.
That one was on purpose. So sorry to interrupt you earlier, Taylor.
That's okay.
Okay, so thinking about the end in mind, as Deborah asked us to do, for me, keeping our water on is a matter of public health, but also so critical to our local economy. I know that we're, making estimates based on the information we have. I've talked to a couple of industry professionals when they've worked on right sizing accounts. And it seems to me that we also need to acknowledge that having accurate readings with the new meters may mean that people's water bills do go up, even if we maybe across the board, even if we have an estimate of percentages. So once again, these are the estimates based on the information we have, but we're working towards those fair and equitable water rates. So I just want to acknowledge that. We did have a letter of concern from the Asheville Independent Restaurant Association. So I just wanted to acknowledge the impact on our local businesses. And I appreciate the commitment to push for state funding, which we're going to see on our legislative agenda coming up. So I guess my question is, if we did have a successful advocacy with local partners to get a line item in the state budget for some of these capital investments that need to be made to keep our water on, then what would it look like for us to adjust our plan? Would it be something that we would consider in the 3-year phasing doing in future years, or would we make an attempt to change midstream?
Taylor, do you want me to respond to that?
Sure.
Okay. Ms. Ronnie, we are making a commitment to you all because every budget cycle, we look at fees and charges. And so if we get additional information, we will surely mid-year or whenever adjust those rates because again, the intent with these adjustments is really to address a lot of the capital needs that we have. It is not to kind of punish or unfairly adjust rates. It is a need right now and a significant need. So if we get additional information, we will definitely come back, reassess, and make recommendations for adjustments.
Thank you. And as someone who's voted against increasing the water rates for the past 3 years because I was concerned about the right sizing, I am prepared to support this year because I know we're taking steps towards that fair and equitable right sizing of the water rates, but I also helping people flush their toilets for 10 days during the water outage. I know the importance of keeping the water on too.
It's on.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to, we've been digging into this the last several committee meetings with lots of work. Taylor and everyone in the water department has been really digging into the options. I appreciate that. Last month, we looked at what if we extended this process from a 3-year approach to a 5-year. And I was hoping to see different numbers, but the numbers don't lie. The reality is if we extended this to 5 years, it would ultimately result in higher costs for the ratepayers. And I feel like the more I keep digging into these numbers, the more I see a pattern of making it less painful today, but making it more painful in the long run when we're talking about our infrastructure. And I can't do that. I know it's going to be hard. I've been talking with a lot of the commercial businesses and they're concerned about these jumps. And I feel like by deferring the maintenance, by making it easier tomorrow, it makes it harder 3 days from then. And in this case, it's not just harder, it's wildly more expensive if we extend this out 5 years. And I don't feel comfortable taking those type of financial decisions. I think we need to really right size our financial stewardship approach so that we have greater financial sustainability. So I'm in a place of support, although I wish that I had a wand to make things different. I have been in many conversations with state legislators, our local delegation, with folks from the commercial business groups who are interested in this. You know, as Councilwoman Roney mentioned, we're going to see on our legislative agenda a conversation about looking for infrastructure money at the state level. So to me, I'm in support of this, and I feel like my work has just gotten started. You know, we have to approve fees and charges, but there's a lot of lobbying towards the state to get the resources we need that I'm prepared to do. So open call for collaboration on that.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm wondering if we take these individually in terms of the vote, or would you like to do it at the end? We've got.
I think we usually do fees and charges as a package. So let's try for that. Okay. If the people want to break it out at that point, that's fine too.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. And Councilmember Ullman, if you find that magic wand, please pick one up for me too.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, next slide. I think we're moving into parking services. Keep on going. So again, repeat from the council retreat And again, a variation on a theme, we have some significant aging infrastructure and deferred maintenance challenges, especially as it relates to our parking garages. In the current year, we have seen some revenue issues related to meter batteries, overall demand, and some closures to address some of those deferred maintenance needs in the parking garages. We don't think that that's going to ultimately be a problem because we also see expenses likely, coming in under those revenues. So again, not an issue from a budget perspective. I just wanted to bring that to the attention of the committee and to council. And then again, on the opportunity side, similarly, we have good information. We have the parking garage assessment. You all heard some of that information at a work session. I believe that was in November of last year. Some recommendations for repairs and ongoing maintenance that will help us extend the useful life of those garages and improve the ADA accessibility. Some of those repairs are already underway. Again, that's part of the garage closure issue. We also have a comprehensive review that we are starting to assess the service delivery. So kind of looking a little bit more on the operational side, but including the fee structure and potential to expand services. And again, we have this opportunity to adjust the fees that will help us get that revenue, to invest in those capital repairs. We are, because we have that study underway, trying to minimize those changes. We're waiting to complete that assessment. And we're really focused on trying to generate the revenue that we need, again, to start on the financial side, to build up the funding so that we can execute on some of those immediate needs in the parking garages. Next slide. So looking at on-street, we have two changes that we're recommending. One is moving the hourly rate from $1.50 to $2 an hour. The main reason that we're doing that is it's best practice to have your on-street parking ideally a little bit more expensive than your off-street, than your garage. Partly because that helps drive some of the longer-term parking to the garages, drive some of the traffic, the literal traffic, not foot traffic, vehicular traffic to the garages. And right now, our on-street parking is actually cheaper than our garages, which are $2. So this really gets it to equity. We think this is a step that we need to make. We think this is likely going to be aligned with any recommendations from that operational assessment. So that's why we're suggesting that move forward. We also know that we have a lot of interest in downtown and folks around downtown after 6 p.m., which is when the current enforcement ends Monday through Saturday. So we're recommending extending that for 3 hours. Really, again, because we think that that is aligned with where we need to go broadly. And then you can see, again, some additional estimated revenue. Those are, again, based off of, some assumptions, but we think that this is going to help us generate some of that revenue that we need to address those needs in the parking decks or the garages. Next slide. A few more proposed changes in the garages, and I'll try to walk through these and hopefully clarify. So those first two, lowering the daily max and the lost ticket fee to $15 an hour, that's really more about trying to provide another parking option for folks and incentivize some parking in the deck. So the idea there is that if you want to spend a whole day downtown, which we hope folks do, right, of course, that you can park in the deck and you can kind of forget about it. The most you're going to pay is $15 an hour. So we don't really anticipate that lowering those is going to generate additional revenue. We think more folks may stay up to that daily max. But the intent there isn't really to generate revenue. It's really more about, again, trying to provide another option for patrons. Another change that we like to make is currently all hourly parkers receive the first hour free. So whether you park 1 hour or you park for 5 hours, you're not paying for that first hour. We'd like to change that so that it is essentially, if you are in and out of the deck in under 60 minutes, then that's free. But if you're there for 2 hours, then you're paying for 2 hours. Figuring out the estimate on that is a little bit challenging, again, because certainly behaviors will change as a result of that, but we think, again, that will help generate some of that revenue that we need. And then this last one on the special event rate, we charge a lower rate for multi-day events. That's $7, but for single-day events at the Civic Center, they get charged, it's $9 an hour. And this is really, again, not intended necessarily to generate substantial additional revenue. It's really more of efficiency and customer service issue to just have a flat rate so that we can make sure that we're publicizing that. People are aware of what they're going to pay. The folks that are responsible for taking that money, there's no, just eliminating some of the complications there essentially. So again, most of those are less about generating revenue and more about just trying to improve efficiency and provide options for customers. Next slide. So a little bit of comparative data with some nearby places, as well as some other cities where parking staff kind of benchmark against that are, kind of tourist destinations similar to Asheville. I think from a broad strokes perspective, we're roughly in the ballpark. I don't think either our proposed or current rates are, wildly off base from what we're seeing here. Again, we can dig into any specifics if you all have questions. I think, certainly different cities are looking to do different things with their parking, whether that's incentivize people to come downtown, in some cases, or again, provide that flexibility and options for parkers that are coming to their downtown. But I think generally we could say that we're in the ballpark of where we see our peers. Next slide. So I wanted to talk briefly about some monthly parking options and some opportunities that we have for folks that work downtown. So kind of to set the scene, our normal rates in the garages, so monthly rates for 24/7 access, you can see there for our 4 parking garages range from $100 to $130. You can move to the next slide. We have a few different rates for folks. Councilmember Roney, happy to answer a question.
No, just go ahead with this one. I just want to, maybe we can pause after we look at the monthly parking.
Sure. So we have a 12-hour rate that's kind of a daytime rate that's a bit cheaper for all of the garages. And then we also provide a sunset rate, which provides access to those garages from 4 p.m. to 7 a.m. during the week, and then 24 hours Saturday and Sunday. Again, that's really driven towards folks that are working evenings and weekends to provide a cheaper option for those folks that are working downtown. We also have a number of surface lots around downtown, and the monthly costs to those are free in some instances. So like the employee parking lot next to City Hall, obviously employees are there during the day, but that is free on nights and weekends. But those range from that free to $60. And then we have some on-street permit parking in some places on some streets around downtown that ranges from $30 to $50. So I will pause here because I think there's probably a question.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm inclined to support parking fee increases because if we just rely on property taxes, it hits the local folks every single day. Whereas parking fee increases is an opportunity to capture some of our tourist dollars for our infrastructure. And I know I've been in conversations for the past few weeks about infrastructure, and folks are like, why do we have so many resources and yet our stuff is worn down? And it's because for years, consecutive years, we have had a lot of use on all of our public assets from the increased daytime population and tourism. So that said, I've heard from several workers and worker organizations that the increase in the time period is going to pinch folks. And so what I'm looking for is ways that we can mitigate the impact on the people who live and work downtown, because downtown's also a neighborhood. And what I'm hearing here is like the sunset rate is a mitigation strategy. However, what it doesn't tell me is that is this really an option? Because I hear there's a long wait list. for these decks. So if it's like, here's the mitigation, but good luck getting a spot, do we need to increase the number of monthly parking spots in our decks?
Sure. So I can give you a little bit of an idea of where some of those sit. I probably won't go through each in detail, but I can tell you, so the county, they operate 2 decks downtown. They have an affordable parking program. They've allotted 200 spaces and 143 of those are taken. So those spaces there are 50 spots in College Street deck and 150 in the Cox Avenue deck. So those are provided at $40 a month. So that, again, there's still some spaces, a decent number of spaces left in the county program. Looking at ours, and again, this is happy to provide kind of where it stands currently in more detail, but I'll just give you kind of a little bit of some information for. So our under $40 parking options, monthly options, we have 70 total spaces that are rented and 15, it looks like, that are available currently. Those are likely all some of that on-street monthly permit parking. We have a few that are under, or I guess between $40 and $60. It looks like 71 of those are rented and only 1 available. And again, I won't go into the detail on each lot and each garage, but there are some, it looks like right now, and again, this is going to change day to day, but information that Parking Services provided, there are 52 monthly spots available across all the garages. I can't tell you for sure how many of those are available as it relates to the sunset rate, but we can certainly, again, dig a little bit deeper if that's something that you all would like us to provide.
Yeah, I think that helps. And thank you for that general kind of glance at it. I think as we, in between this meeting and our council approval of the rates, we will probably hear from folks and organizations about the need to mitigate the pinch points, because that's kind of like where we are now before the rate increases and the hour extensions. So being able to, I think, communicate that effectively with the public will help. For example, like an on-street permit, does it have to be an individual resident that applies for it? Can it be a business because maybe they have issues with loading zones being constantly full, and so they're looking for a permit spot? That doesn't need an answer today. I just think we should be ready to answer in like a systemic way for some of these questions as they come forward. So thank you for that quick glance.
Councilmember Ullman.
And I know there's a couple more slides on this one, but it's kind of dovetailing with some of what you were sharing, Kim. So I wanted to kind of talk through. I think that the sunset rate, as well as the proposal for extending on-street hours, is kind of the connection point. I think that those evening hours is a unique demand for parking downtown. And not only does it get to service workers or folks who are feeding us when we go out to eat, but also kind of the family recreation, during school, during day hours, people are in school. And a question I had going back to, I guess that we're around like slide 19 with the on-street parking. I'm doing really crude math here, but I'm curious if we looked at, instead of extending hours through 9 o'clock to get to that $500,000, if we looked at another 50 cents on the hourly rate. Because when we look at Wilmington, who I see very much as a peer city in North Carolina based on their tourism economy, they're up to $250 an hour. So I understand there's a lot of math involved here, and I'm doing some like crass calculations in my head. But I'm curious if we looked at, instead of extending the hours, increasing the rate. I also am curious, I believe I read that these proposed figures account for the increased cost of staff. So there would still be a net of 490, even though we need to increase staff. So I also have a concern about our ability to retain staff in parking services. So I'm just kind of wondering, did you run those numbers on keeping 8 to 6, but increasing from 150 to 250? If you didn't, could we? Or if you did, like, what comes up as you're hearing some of the mental gymnastics I'm playing to see if we can retain free parking after 6 on street?
Sure. I think Jessica can probably address the specifics of the impacts on the customers better than I can. We've looked at a number of different opportunities. Certainly, we could look at making that adjustment, but I'll let Jessica kind of talk a little bit about parking's view of customer impact.
So first, just want to re-mention that we're in the beginning stages of the operational assessment, which is going to look at all of these various options. And so what is being proposed now is kind of a tiptoe into what we think will be potentially additional changes. So raising the rate by 50 cents is consistent with previous studies and what we think is the direction that we need to go. It's not just about revenue, it's really also about management of on-street spaces and encouraging turnover and trying to get folks that are needing parking for a longer duration to head to our garages. So in the on-street hours, adding 3 hours is really also about trying to manage that on-street parking and provide turnover so that there is availability and you don't just have necessarily someone parking there for multiple hours on end. We did look at different rate options, and there's kind of like a variety of ways that we could do it. We've looked at rates that go up to $2.50. We've looked at rates that vary based on the location. So like if you're parked at a meter that's maybe farther out from the core of downtown, maybe it's a lesser hourly rate. And so it's very possible that we'll explore those options through this study. What we're proposing now, we feel like is consistent with the direction that we need to go in order to raise revenue, but also provide better parking management, parking services.
A follow-up. So I guess where I'm just want to be exploring further is I understand that we need to have some more resources to do a great job with our decks, and that many of the proposals are about incremental increases or shifts to folks who are already paying parking. It's a pretty big change to extend the hours till 9 o'clock.
Right.
And I also come from a school of thought where if you really looked at every square foot of publicly owned land, I think the amount that we dedicate to parking and roads is probably more than I would prefer. I'd rather see parks and community centers. So I'm not a big fan of using public space to store people's vehicles while people are enjoying our community. I also feel like as we're pursuing this study, I want to hear that we're like very certain that extending on-street hours and staffing that is a certainty of what we're going to see we need. Mm-hmm. Because if the operational study tells us something different, that's a big change to extend and then peel back or tweak. Like, I don't want to, that's a big communication conversation. So like if the communications around that is pretty substantial alone. So that's where I'm having curiosity. And then I was just doing some math in my head of like, well, what if we increase this? And what I hear you saying is that extending the hours is also about incentivizing people to move to the deck so that there can be more turnover, so that when I come in for my 6 o'clock dinner, you could come in for your 8 o'clock dinner and there's more availability. And so that makes a lot of sense. So I guess kind of my follow-up question is around, is this the best practice direction that you're fairly certain we're going to see no matter what for the management side of the spaces?
Yes, it is a best practice, and it's also about a combination of things. So not necessarily just raising rates or just extending hours. Like, we're looking at trying to deploy a combination of ways to manage our operations better and more equitably. So if we had a certain revenue number that we were looking to achieve, then we could just raise the rates to make that number. But it's not really about that. It's about trying to manage the curb space as fairly and equitably as we possibly can. And put that on the users, but in a way that spreads the burden, if you will, as equitably as possible. So we're also going to be through the study looking at expansion, so that it's not just necessarily on the core of downtown or on garage patrons. So it's about an umbrella of options that we're looking at.
And remind me of, it'll be next budget cycle that we'll be seeing the suggestions from that. Okay.
Yeah, it might actually be sooner. Like we and again, this is scheduled to go into effect July 1. So between now and then, I think we'll make substantial headway on that study, and we may tweak some of these ideas based on that. But we wanted to bring something forward now as part of this process to start the conversation, and we'll have some, I think, early results from that study prior to July 1.
Great, thanks. That answers my questions on this.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, I think we're on slide 24. So, and kind of already referenced a bit, what service improvements would we anticipate these additional revenues helping to fund? The main one, again, being that $11.3 million of capital repairs that we identified through the assessment that will help to extend the life of these facilities. So again, I think we don't typically think of parking garages as facilities, but that is what they are. And these repairs are about improving some accessibility, but also making sure that those continue to function well over the next 50 years, as they have for the most part over the last 50. In addition to those identified repairs, the study also recommended that we spend around $1 million a year in ongoing garage maintenance. So we won't be doing that immediately, right? We'll be focused on that larger number, but we also want to set ourselves up to be able to fund that going forward. And as mentioned, with that extension of hours later in the evening, we will need some additional enforcement staff. Those additional staff can also help us to address some of the enforcement and other parking issues that are happening outside of the central business district or downtown. That's something that APD had been doing, and through reimagining and staffing shortages, parking has kind of taken the lead on that, but they could certainly use some additional support in that role. So again, some potential opportunity to help improve service outside of where we think of parking services kind of typically providing their services, again, in that downtown core. Next slide. Any other questions?
And Taylor, our parking fees do support transit.
Yes,
correct? Okay.
Correct.
I just wanted to make sure that everyone understood that it's not just about parking. It is actually also supporting another mode
That was one of the things.
transportation.
Yeah, it's not really a question so much as like, I know folks are watching this conversation right now, hoping that we're going to say we're not going to increase parking fees. But once again, I really would like to capture tourist dollars for this. We're going to see later on a legislative agenda and ask for more of our hotel occupancy taxes. So once again, we need more revenue sources, including the revenue that's here that goes towards advertising when we clearly have huge needs in our community. But there is something else that I'm thinking of. I know there was just a conversation at PED committee about this, the transit, state of transit. We need more partnership with the county. We know this. We can do the phasing in the transit master plan so we can connect workers and residents more effectively through our city and through our downtown. But the downtown circulator is in a later phase for a reason. We have got to prioritize the South Asheville transit routes. We have to get the evening service hours extended so that people can get to and from work, not just to work, and then 30% of our routes at or before 7:30. But these are the kinds of ways that we could move people more effectively without cars and not having to use so much of our public space for parking if we had more partnerships with the county. And so that's not lost on me, that that's among the work that needs to happen when we talk about transportation from like a zoomed out bigger picture. And I know that we're working on it, but of course it all falls on this group to make the decision around fees and charges. And that's why I'll be supporting parking at this phase, because I know that we're going to work on those mitigation and communication strategies on how to mitigate this for the people who live and work downtown.
Thank you. All right. Well, I think the next one up is stormwater. We can move to the next slide. So again, y'all are probably tired of hearing me say this. We have some aging infrastructure and deferred maintenance needs in the stormwater system that are going to require substantial resources. We also have some additional strain from development and more frequent storm events that are making it a little more challenging to manage that system. On the opportunity side, we have this ongoing program analysis and fee study that's helped us to identify where we need to make some investments in that system. One of those investments that we're already underway is the system mapping project. We actually received a grant to help offset some of the cost of that, and that's really about just making sure we have a good handle on what our existing system looks like, where it is, and again, really help us focus in on where that maintenance needs to occur. And then we have this opportunity to generate some additional revenue to help address these challenges. Next slide. So again, we have that aging infrastructure and deferred maintenance, which means we're spending a lot of time addressing failures and making emergency repairs, which is not, maintenance. It's not strategic management of the system. It's just putting fires out, which we'd like to get away from again by improving our system and better maintaining our system. These projects are often very complex. There's frequently easement acquisitions or other utilities underneath the road or in the ground that makes these projects really challenging to scope, as appropriately cost and just deliver. They're just really complex projects. We have, again, those increasing needs due to more flood events that are straining our system, but we do have that analysis that's underway currently. Next slide. So what we're recommending is around, I believe, a 7% increase across all of the tiers. You can see there are most single-family homes fall into that 2,001 to 4,000 square foot tier, the tier 2, and you can see that per month impact again of that 7% increase is relatively minor. Next slide. So again, looking to what we would utilize that additional revenue to, how we would utilize that additional revenue to improve the service. We have some additional equipment and capital needs, again, just to maintain ongoing maintenance. We're looking at a position that would just help kind of backfill where we may have gaps in our service, whether that's street sweeping, the VACCON system cleaning vehicles, the folks that drive those around. We have a camera crew that has a camera that actually goes and inspects the system so that we know where we need to make maintenance or can address needs. And then we also have some pretty significant utility locations. So when folks call up, if they're digging, how do we make sure that we respond to those needs? We're looking additionally at some additional positions for development review to make sure that we can continue to provide that service in a timely fashion. And one other item that is not on this list that I do want to mention, we're still trying to work through exactly what this might look like, If it was to be funded, it would probably be a half year. But as you all know, we are looking at general obligation bonds in November. If those were to pass, well, let me back up. Those are likely to include a significant amount of repaving. If that was to pass, one of the things that we do kind of ahead of our repaving projects is replace stormwater infrastructure so that we're not putting fresh pavement over old infrastructure that's either inadequately sized or needs to be replaced. So that's one thing that we're just trying to figure out exactly what that looks like, how we need to fund that and staff that again in the next year. So we may adjust these service improvements slightly before you see a proposed budget, but I just wanted to bring that to your attention that that's something that's still kind of under review that we're considering. Next slide. Any questions about stormwater? All right, well, we will move on to sanitation. Getting close to the end here. You can go to the next slide. And wanted to mix it up and not have the challenges and opportunities slide, but really wanted to give you all a little bit of a history of how we've invested in this service over the last several years. So you can see there was a big jump in the fee, so that those numbers at the top are the fee that we charge for that service in FY17, but we really held that flat at $14 for several years. And as our costs to deliver that service grew, the revenue that we're bringing in grows incrementally as we add new customers. But again, there's additional costs associated with those new customers. So in FY23, we did increase that. You all approved an increase of $2. That helped to fund a solid waste master plan, which is currently underway, as well as some additional staff. And again, we have a recycling contract that is a fully contracted service for both disposal and the pickup. And the contractor that provides that has escalators in their contract. So what we're looking for this year is a $1 increase that would help to primarily maintain our existing level of service. Next slide. So that would include offsetting the cost of compensation changes for sanitation staff, as well as that recycling contract increase. We are looking at adding an additional position really to just better align our staffing with yard waste and bulky load routes. So we kind of have two sides of the house as it relates to collection. One is those types of collections, which are slightly different from the kind of what we think of the regular, the trash trucks. We're also looking to add a position that's focused on waste reduction that will allow us to expand our recycling and education outreach. Some of that work was previously contracted with Asheville Greenworks. They're not doing that anymore, so it's not the full cost of an entire position, but it will kind of replace that work and allow us to expand that. And then we just need, again, an additional vehicle to help support some of those special collections, being able to do receptacle maintenance and other items like that, making sure that we have the equipment that our staff needs to get their job done. Next slide. Any questions about sanitation? All right, we will keep moving on. So summary and next steps, you can go to the next slide. Again, just wanted to come back to this typical residential household impact for, again, those three major fees that every household in the city is paying. You can see that total annual increase to just under $20 a year. Next slide. Did want to mention, I think this is the next one. We do have a few other recommended changes. Those are outlined specifically in the staff report. For water, there are a number of adjustments to a variety of fees and charges. Most of those are related to development or like new access to the system. So it's review fees, fees related to fire hydrants, new taps or meters, testing and sampling. We generally look at those fees annually and make adjustments based on the cost to deliver those services. Again, those are not paid by most of our customers. Those are really primarily specific to commercial or development related items. And then we did have one other thing I wanted to mention in Public Works, and this is general fund revenue. It's relatively minor. We do have a program where residents can request curb installation. We're doing kind of two things. One is changing the material that we utilize for that from asphalt to concrete. That's just a better material, longer lasting material. Doesn't cause as many stormwater issues as the asphalt does. So that's just a change that Public Works is recommending. Concrete curbing is much more expensive than a built up asphalt curb. So the fee is changing for that. And then we also want to clarify for customers what is involved in that request. So right now it just kind of says you can request a curb, and those requests do have to be reviewed. We have to make sure that it makes sense to install a curb there. So we just wanted to provide a little more clarity in the fee manual around that, so that folks don't think that they can call the city up and have a curb put outside of their house, for example, because it's a bit more complicated and complex than that would suggest. Any questions about either of those two items? All right, next slide. So our requested action would be for the committee to recommend these proposed changes outlined in this presentation and in the staff report for approval at City Council on March 26th. So that would be the next City Council meeting 2 weeks from today. Next slide. As we look to next steps, it would be that that March 26th meeting will certainly incorporate any feedback from today and any additional information requested. We'll present our recommended fee changes and then look to council to either approve those changes or ask for any additional adjustments. And again, just as a reminder, the reason that we ask you all to approve these fee changes in advance of the budget is so that we have the time to communicate these changes to our customers, since they will go into effect July 1st. And then also so that we can incorporate these additional revenues and any service enhancements that we outlined into the proposed budget, the manager's recommended budget that we will bring in May. I think the next slide is back to our key takeaways. Again, normal part of the process, smaller part of the general fund, larger part of enterprise funds. And then we're making changes primarily to those three major fees that every household pays, residential household pays, and parking fees. So if we can go back to the recommended motion, I think that's where I end it. And again, happy to answer any additional questions you all have.
I'm ready to make a motion. Make a motion to recommend proposed changes to fees and charges for approval by City Council on March 26, 2024.
And with appreciation that we're going to work on mitigating some of these impacts with our legislative agenda and with communicating options for workers and residents in the parking, I second the motion.
Okay, thank you. We have a motion and a second. I'll do a roll call vote. Councilwoman Kim Roney.
Aye.
And Councilwoman Maggie Ullman.
Aye.
And myself, aye. All right, thank you. We'll move this on to the City Council, and thank you very much, Taylor.
Thank you.
Okay, we have one other agenda item, and that is our 2024 legislative agenda, and Brad Branham, our city attorney, will present that.
All right, thank you, Mayor, and a special thanks to Councilmember Roney. I think you gave me the perfect transition into our legislative agenda this morning. Good morning, all committee members. As I mentioned, I'm going to be presenting to you today the draft Asheville City Council legislative agenda, which would be shared for the upcoming short session of the North Carolina General Assembly's legislative calendar. Now, as you know, the legislative agenda is our tool that allows you to share your legislative priorities with our local legislative delegation, as well as the General Assembly at large. Next slide. I do have a few key takeaways for you, as always, that I want to share. The upcoming short session is going to be convening in April, so we are at the cusp of the next legislative door opening. The legislative agenda is our primary means of transmitting your shared legislative goals, not just with our legislative delegation, but with the public at large. We've been successful utilizing this tool in the past. In the most recent long session, within the past few sessions, we were able to obtain changes in the occupancy tax utilization ratio, the ability to utilize civilian traffic investigators, and obtaining funding to mitigate some stormwater pollution in the French Broad River Basin. The proposed legislative agenda for this year is just a little different in one regard. It's been divided into two separate sections. The first are our short session priorities, and the second is our general legislative request. Now, the reason for this division is not because we want to value those initial priorities more. It is simply because in a short session, there is a much more restricted allowance for what types of bills can be filed. So we want to place some additional focus on those that seem to align with that allowance for bill filing, while still continuing the narrative around those other items that we believe are of utmost importance for continued legislative support. Now, these agenda items represent those matters which are pertinent to and appropriate for potential legislative action. That does not mean that this is a fully comprehensive list of all those things that are important or priorities for this council or the city, but they are limited to those things which could potentially see some legislative action by the General Assembly. This matter will go before the full city council at its March 26th meeting if advanced by this particular body. Next slide. I do want to give you just a few quick details on short sessions in general. They are held in even numbered years following the closure of a long session in the prior year. They are what they sound like, intended to be short, only lasting a few weeks generally, although that has in recent years started to increase along with the increase that we've seen in long sessions. This upcoming session will begin on April the 24th. Now, bill consideration is going to be limited, as I mentioned. In short sessions, that is always the case. They usually restrict bill filing to only those matters that affect the state budget, which was previously passed. However, there are some minor allowances for additional legislation. New bills must be submitted by April 15th and introduced by either May 2nd all the way up to May 7th, depending upon the kind of bill. Next slide. I want to now dive into our actual proposed legislative priorities. And as I mentioned, these are divided into two distinct sections. The first are our short session priorities, again, trying to focus on those items that seem to be within the purview of allowable bills for a short session. Starting with the first item, we are seeking funding opportunities for investment in critical local infrastructure and services. As council knows, infrastructure and core services was designated at your recent retreat as a council priority. And as the city continues to see population growth and increased service demand from both locals and our visitors, we believe that investment in these facilities and services is more essential than ever. Therefore, we are asking specifically for capital funding supplements for our water treatment facilities, our city streets, sidewalks, and bridges, stormwater infrastructure, parking decks, public safety and park and rec facilities, public transit, as well as our public entertainment facilities such as Thomas Wolfe, Harrah's, and McCormick Field. The second item is a request to support new state funding to assist property owners with reducing stormwater pollution. Along with our community partners, we are asking for additional funding for the Community Conservation Assistance Program, also known as CCAP. This program allows Western North Carolina's soil and water conservation districts to assist property owners in reducing stormwater pollution in impaired waterways. Unfortunately, the French Broad River in part has been designated as an impaired waterway. So we are asking specifically for a one-time additional state funding supplement of $500,000 to increase the reoccurring yearly funding in order to specifically target the French Broad watershed. Item number 3, we are asking to reform the local occupancy tax utilization rules. The goal here would be to direct a more equitable distribution of funds collected through this tax by amending the committee guidelines around this, as well as the statutory rules. This would allow for the occupancy tax expenditure distribution ratio to at least reach 50% of those collected funds being dedicated towards local community needs. Moving on to the next slide, please. Now, I do want to move into those items which we've designated as our general legislative request. Once again, there is no lower degree of importance being assigned to these. However, they often seem to exist slightly outside of the normal short session bill allowance, but we believe that because they are important, we want to continue communicating these priorities to our legislative delegation. And I'll start with the first one, where we are asking to oppose legislation that would limit any reasonable regulation of short-term rental or short-term vacation rentals as we define it. We believe here that local control is absolutely essential on this issue to protect the character of our local neighborhoods, our housing supply and affordability, and to manage building safety issues. Second, we're asking to support new legislation and state funding to encourage the development of affordable housing. We're hoping that such legislation would create new tools and increased incentives and subsidies, as well as providing dedicated state funding for the development and preservation of affordable housing. Item number 3, we're asking for legislation that would, to oppose legislation that would remove or further restrict any local authority for conditional zoning. It is the opinion of the City of Asheville that conditional zoning facilitates optimal land development while also affording the development community and the public at large more access to the process and the members of City Council. We believe that it remains the best and most equitable land development review process available in our state, and we're asking for it to be protected and preserved. Next slide. The next item, we're asking to support legislation that would update property taxation rules to provide for greater protection and equitable treatment for homeowners. As has already been implemented in other states, this would allow a differential property tax treatment for owner-occupied properties versus second homes or income-producing properties, and increase opportunities for additional tax exemptions for low-income, elderly, and homestead current exemptees. Item number 5, we're asking to amend the North Carolina Fair Housing Act to include source of income and funds as a protected class or characteristic. Currently, individuals utilizing federally funded housing choice values can be turned away from opportunities to lease residential property. If these additional characteristics were added as a protected class, those individuals would have the same access and protection to utilize those vouchers in order to obtain housing as someone with a different means of payment. Item number 6, we're asking to support state and local efforts for reparations efforts. In support of another one of your council priorities, we're asking for any legislative changes that would empower local governments, removing barriers and provide existing funding to support reparations at the state and local levels. And finally, item number 7, we're asking to support legislation that would require online short-term rental platforms to include a locally issued permit to complete any online listings. Requiring the online rental platforms to include a locally issued permit number on every listing would ensure that all online listings were legal listings. This would protect both those who are utilizing short-term rental in the right way and assist cities' efforts in enforcement by removing illegal listings at the source. Next slide. Now, as we wrap that up, I do want to highlight the legislative agenda timeline. Obviously, we're coming to this council for this council committee for the first public viewing of the proposed agenda. We do plan to come to council at your March 22nd meeting for final review and recommendation by the full council. Thereafter, if directed, I would be submitting the final legislative agenda to our local delegation and to any other parties we feel is appropriate. And this would also kick off the season of continuing to work with those individuals to implement these legislative changes. As far as the deadline for filing bills, which I already mentioned, it's a bit varying depending upon the kind of bill, but those are set somewhere between May 2nd and May 7th. As for the end of the session, I'm only guessing because there is no statutory automatic end. I suggest that given the short session trends, we're probably looking at sometime in at least June, but that could extend a little further. Next slide. Now, once again, Council, I do want to just highlight the key takeaways, letting you know that we are at the precipice of the short session of the General Assembly, which should not last too terribly long, but it will begin in April. And we are hoping that this legislative agenda allows us to continue the conversation we've been having now for several years, advancing your legislative priorities to the General Assembly. We have seen some successes in recent years that have been notable, and we're hoping that this legislative agenda can continue that trend. Again, we have divided this for the first time into two separate sections, not to state the priority of one section over another, but to hopefully help our legislative delegation with the difference between those bills that are much more appropriate for the legislative agenda allowance, while continuing the conversation around those additional items of importance. Again, these items do not represent the full universe of things that matter to you as council or to the city, but they are items we feel might have an allowance for a legislative reaction, and that's why they've reached a point of being included on this agenda. Once again, and finally, we will be presenting this full agenda to the City Council on March the 26th. Next slide. All right, I do have a proposed motion for you, but I am happy to answer any additional questions or provide additional information as you may need. Councilmember Roney.
Thank you, Brad, for your work in preparing this legislative agenda. I think it represents some of the really critical issues our community faces. And also by documenting it in this way allows us to be public about the needs that we have and for our community to back us up as well. We heard more about this with the water conversation earlier. I just wanted to add a note that the source of income protections being added, it helps folks that have veteran vouchers, child support payments, any legal tender that folks are using to pay their rent. And folks are being currently discriminated against from being able to use legal tender to pay for their rent. They're being prevented from signing leases. We know this. So Virginia, as a state, has added this to their housing protection. So we're not asking something that's not common or even next door to us. The hotel occupancy taxes, in all honesty, I think 50% isn't enough. I would love to be asking for more, but I think another thing I'm curious if our council is interested in is talking about a cap, like how far are we going to be having to ask for changes every 2-3 years? Should it be capped at even, let's say, 20 million, which is once again, I think not enough. But if we end up seeing the hotel occupancy continue to climb to 70 million, 80 million, like it seems to me that the public perception is that the TDA has a hard time spending the percentage of funding on advertising on things that are considered public benefits. So for me, this is considered really the lowest place that I could negotiate and hope to find that it is on this legislative agenda as the highest priority. So for me, I would love to honestly see more, but I'm thankful that it's there. And then the last thing that I wanted to highlight is also as a question. So in 2021, we were looking at joining the city portal, which would have done the automatic enforcement across the platforms for the largest platforms for short-term rental listings. And if we don't get this at the state level, I think we still need to look at it at the local level. One of the things I really appreciated was the conversation about enforcement for legal use. We have residentially zoned property that's being used for a commercial use. And that's like one of the biggest roles and responsibilities of our city council is land use. So I am appreciative of how it's done, but I guess my curiosity is, are we still prepared to move this forward at a local level if it doesn't pass the state? And if so, where would we see that come next?
I don't know about that last part. Brad can probably speak to that, but I did want to weigh in on the legislative agenda generally. Brad and I had a chance to meet with Julie Mayfield, our state senator, in crafting this agenda and kind of reviewing it ahead of time. And she was helpful in making a couple of the suggestions that you see here, and some additions mostly around environmental types of matters that might be possible this legislative session. On the occupancy tax, I totally agree. Our occupancy tax situation in Buncombe County is not working for us at all, and that is an understatement. It's grown to a size that is lopsided in terms of the impacts tourism has on our city and our ability as a city to leverage funds to manage that, the number of people that are visiting. Just, for example, deteriorating parking deck infrastructure. We can use parking fees to pay for repairs, the $11 million in repairs needed to our parking decks, but it's a little bit of a head scratcher for a tourist community not to be able to leverage tourism tax dollars for repairs to things like this, and especially when other communities are able to do that. I will say in the negotiation to amend the occupancy tax legislation a few years ago, there were many meetings, and Brownie Newman and I and Julie Mayfield and others met with a lot of folks to try to get consensus, because without consensus, we were not going to be able to get anything through the legislature. And the cap concept was talked about then. But I don't see any reason why we shouldn't make another go at it, even if it didn't work then. I think I recently heard from the head lobbyist for the Lodging Association on this issue. She was meeting with several mayors on taxing issues in tourism, because other cities in North Carolina are feeling the same pain, not to the degree we do, but they are feeling it. And what I heard from her was some openness to more flexibility in the spending, interpreting the legislation to allow some more flexibility, but I know that's also a tricky issue. So I'm sort of just saying there's a lot of options out there for how to deal with this, and I hope that we're, and I know what we're doing is trying to keep the door wide open to figuring out all those solutions so that we can find something that makes more sense for Asheville. Now, as I said here, I know that folks are watching this, and I'm already getting some communication about it. So this is, the beginning of a conversation, and another beginning to this conversation for this legislative session. Brad, the point that Kim was making about what happens if we can't get legislation that allows us to require permit numbers or some other way for us to be able to regulate the short-term rental occurrences in our community. What are you? I know you've tried many times to get the platforms themselves to agree to provide information to us that would help us with enforcement.
Yeah, it has been an ongoing dialogue. There has not been a tremendous amount of activity in that in the last year or so, but we have an extensive history of discussing with the platforms the ability to cooperate with the city, to share some of the responsibility for enforcement. At their end, this is not at all unprecedented. This is something that has come into effect in multiple cities around the country, places like Boston, Miami. They have agreements of this nature in places throughout the country and the world. So this is something that is, in fact, a trend moving in this direction as more and more cities are making the platforms aware of the necessity to provide some assistance on this front. And I do believe that the platform level is the very best and most optimal way to deal with enforcement issues, because they're able to remove illegal listings at the source. So I think those conversations could be restarted if council so desired. They would be voluntary at this point, meaning that the platforms would request some cooperation from council as well. That in the past has taken the form of us giving consideration to perhaps allowing additional possibilities for whole home short-term rental. So there is always a give or take in these discussions. We can always discuss some of those options. I would also suggest to council that part of this request is not only the hope of an offensive win, but a defensive one as well. In the last session, Senate Bill, I believe, 325 was filed, which actually would have provided legislative protection for the platforms from any local ordinance requiring exactly what you're talking about here. So there is some lobbying efforts on the other side of that well, and we think it's important to make them aware that we are looking not only to defend but to try to advance our own legislative interest in this regard. Any other questions about the legislative agenda proposal?
No, but I would like to move to recommend the approval of the proposed City of Asheville 2024 legislative agenda by the full City Council.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Councilwoman Kim Roney,
Aye.
Councilwoman Maggie Ullman,
Aye.
and myself, aye. All right, thank you very much, Brad. We will move.
One other thing on this topic, but not the agenda, is that I know that we work and have worked really closely with a state-based lobbyist, and this legislative agenda is very state-based. I'm not proposing a federal legislative agenda, but I am curious about the conversation, given how much resources have been coming out of the federal government under the Biden administration, what a conversation would look like for us to pursue a relationship with a DC-based lobbyist to advocate for us for federal grant resources. So I just want to put it out there. I'm not sure what the path for that conversation is, but it seems like this is the committee to at least say out loud that I'm interested in us considering that conversation.
I did.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Go ahead, Mayor.
Well, I was just going to say, I appreciate that. I've often wondered that myself. I know there are some cities in North Carolina that work with federal lobbyists, and it really is kind of a different animal than what we do at a state level, in that it's really just someone who's able to find a lot of grant opportunities for us, whether it's around housing or transportation or transit or whatever the case may be. So I would be willing to explore that. I did one year when I was at the U.S. Conference of Mayors. I was with the Winston-Salem lobbyist, who is the DC-based lobbyist, and she's had some good success for them. So I know it's possible. I would be interested in that.
Is that a policy conversation, or is that a staff, is this something that we would need to entertain and discuss more fully? Like, what would the path be, or just other reactions?
I think we could ask Brad just to look and see what the landscape looks like, so we know what we would need to do, and ask that the city manager and Brad talk together. I know there's some concern around, if you go and get all this funding, which would be great, what's our capacity to handle it? What would we want to do with it? What would the strategy be around it?
Yeah, I definitely think that is plenty of a conversation. When I think of the federal departments and their funding streams, I think very much back to like the first bullet on this state legislative priority around infrastructure. When you think of our water infrastructure resources coming from the federal government, clean water, transportation. So yeah, I think, what would the priority set be is a big conversation, but I feel like, I guess even a question, have we ever had one? And if we haven't, I'm very, especially if we have, what did we learn and why did we stop? If we haven't, I'm very curious to try. Now, if you tell me it's $50 million to pay for, then I'm very uninterested. But what does it cost? What's the risk? What timeline? What would a pilot look like? I just feel like I'm sitting in more and more committee meetings, from yesterday hearing the state of transit to today looking at our parking deck to understanding these ongoing water conversations. And I understand that we are still a relatively small city. And so access to federal resources often comes most directly with strong relationships with your congressional representatives. I'm open to that conversation. I'm eager to hear it.
I think I would ask Brad to respond to historically, have we ever had lobbyists at the federal level or coordination with the federal lobbies?
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. I am not aware that the city, and certainly during my time, we have not engaged with a federal lobbyist. Some cities around the state certainly do. Some do in a very limited capacity, perhaps just lobbying on one particular subject matter area. There is a cost that goes along with this. It is considerably less than $50 million a year, so that's a positive. And I can tell you that, as always, trying to anticipate your needs, I've already started the process of beginning to try to gather some information for you about a DC-based federal lobbying program, so you can at least have some understanding of the cost. But my suggestion would be, as you have already highlighted, to work with the city manager in terms of capacity as well, to see what it would mean to be able to receive funds and our ability to actually implement those and spend those dollars, which is sometimes harder than it simply sounds. These are not always just blank checks. There's oftentimes local match requirements and also spending requirements. So this is a holistic question, then we'll gather that information and bring it back to this body for consideration.
The only thing that I would add, thank you, Brad, in terms of advocating for the kind of the coordination, and to you, Mayor, for understanding kind of the capacity issues. But what we would want to do is to be, if we were to move forward, even at the state level, is to be very strategic and targeted in terms of, we are working on these things. You all have identified these priorities. Let's go for those areas where we know we are geared up and ready to receive funding that would supplement initiatives that we have currently underway. It's not to say that we embrace or want to see if there are opportunities that may not be kind of in our wheelhouse right now, but there is a capacity issue. There is a concern that we need to kind of stay focused here, because there are some real critical needs, and we need to address those first.
I hear that. That's a real important point. You know, I think of our journey as an organization from when we did the 2016 bond to us considering a bond next year. It takes capacity, not just to spend the money, but to spend it with the responsibility that we expect, and that our city has built a really good capital team. We have a whole department now that stewards our bond spending, and they do a great job. And it's not as easy as applying and then opening your wallet. It is more complex, especially when we look at existing relationships we have for federal funding. I think of our community development office, where we have a lot of regulatory compliance requirements to that. So I understand the capacity part of it. And I keep thinking, as we grow out of being a big town into a small city, is this a service that we need to take steps towards? And what does it look like in 10 years to be a city who hasn't tried to pursue federal money? And what does it look like in 10 years to a city who's taking calculated steps to test out if getting federal resources is going to be part of who we are? And so, I like the idea of kind of having a think on staff side and then continuing this conversation in this committee. That would be, I'm really up for that. Thanks for letting me add non-agenda thought in.
Yeah. Do we have anyone signed up for public comment? Or not signed up, but anyone in the queue for public comment?
Yes, we do. Just one moment. Caller ending in 1183. Your line is now open.
And whoever the caller is, if you could just introduce yourself, and you'll have 3 minutes to speak. I don't know who's keeping time.
Okay,
but somebody.
Okay, great. Good morning. This is Megan with AIR, Asheville Independent Restaurant. I appreciate the opportunity to share some feedback regarding an increase in water rates for commercial businesses. I submitted a letter yesterday on behalf of our board. This letter was also shared with our restaurant membership. And thanks to Councilmember Roney for mentioning the letter. I'll just reiterate a few points, even though you've already taken a vote on this matter. First, there's been very little engagement from the city to restaurants and other businesses most impacted by this increase. The only meeting that was held, to my knowledge, was organized by the chamber and not by the city. And we appreciate Councilmember Ullman for participating in that meeting. Restaurants, like other businesses, are facing increases in costs from many sides. Inflation to labor costs, which of course is directly connected to the rapid rise of housing costs in our area, the upcoming tax reevaluation, and others. While I understand the deferred maintenance of the water system and other crucial infrastructure is not due to the actions of our current council, it also should not be the responsibility of the business community or our residents. We ask that you take the time to understand the implications for not just restaurants, but other businesses, and consider options which would allow businesses to adjust to the increased cost. And has already been mentioned, and I'm glad to see on your legislative agenda that municipalities have had infrastructure funding appropriated in the state budget. And we at AIR are prepared to work with you all and the chamber and other business associations to advocate for this funding with our state legislatures. Thank you for the time.
Thank you. Okay, Katie, do we have anyone else in the queue?
Yes, we do. Just one moment.
And
Caller
Katie, let me
is-
know. She is the timekeeper. Thank you.
You're welcome. Caller ending in 2161. Your line is now open.
Yeah, hello, this is Robert Foster. I represent the Asheville Buncombe Hotel Association. And along with AIR, the Brewers Alliance, the Chamber, and others, we would like you to all consider the large increase in the water billing for commercial industry. We feel that we would like to be included more in the conversation, as AIR representative had said. We would love to get involved in a permanent solution, maybe working side by side with the city in regards to state funding or other ideas or options that would take maybe some of the burdens from the locally owned businesses that are going to be affected directly, and find other avenues for some of that funding. We recognize absolutely that the investment in the infrastructure in regards to the water services is crucial, and we just want to work with you and be more included in the conversation. So we would really encourage the city to consider delaying maybe some of the actions on this proposal, and allow us to sit down and more openly discuss it with the businesses that are going to be affected. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor, I just reloaded, and that was our last caller.
Okay, thank you. All right, council, that concludes our agenda for today. And unless there's any other business, we will adjourn, and I'll see you this evening.